Before the T-Virus, before the G-Virus, before Umbrella, before Raccoon City, there was a flower. It grew in the Ndipaya region of West Africa, fed by soil that had absorbed something ancient. The locals called it the Stairway to the Sun. And when three men, Oswell Spencer, Edward Ashford, and James Marcus, discovered what that flower could do to human cells, they founded the Umbrella Corporation to weaponize it. That flower contained the Progenitor Virus, the mother strain, the genetic template for every bioweapon that would follow. The T-Virus is a modified progenitor. The G-Virus is built on progenitor genetics. The Uroboros, the C-Virus, the T-Abyss, all of them trace back to this single organism discovered in the 1960s. Tonight, I'm telling you the complete story of the Progenitor Virus, how it was discovered, what Spencer and Ashford saw in it, how it became the foundation of Umbrella's research, and why, 50 years later, every major outbreak in Resident Evil can be traced back to a flower in Africa. The Progenitor Virus isn't a modern invention. It's an ancient organism found deep within a subterranean ecosystem in West Africa. Biologically, it's a double-stranded RNA virus that functions as a molecular architect. It doesn't just hijack a cell to replicate itself like a common cold. It forces a violent rewrite of the host's genetic code. It's been there for hundreds of millions of years, waiting in the dark for a host strong enough to carry it. Think of it as the primordial soup for every nightmare that followed. It has an unstable structure that allows it to bond with almost any organic matter. This instability is what makes it so dangerous and so valuable to people like Spencer. It's not interested in killing the host as its primary goal. It's trying to force a spontaneous mutation that changes the host into something else entirely. It's an evolutionary engine that operates with a terrifying level of aggression. Unlike the viruses we deal with in the real world, Progenitor acts on a prehistoric timescale. It's a relic of a time before complex life took over the planet. When it enters a system, it treats the DNA like a rough draft that needs to be completely overhauled. The result is usually catastrophic because most modern organisms can't handle that level of rapid change. And imagine being the person who opened that first classified file and realized that humanity was just a temporary host for something much older. Researchers often describe it as a viral engine. It provides the energy and the blueprint for a total biological transformation. It's the foundation for the T-Virus and the G-Virus, but in its pure form, it's much more volatile. It doesn't follow the rules of modern virology because it predates the systems those rules were based on. It's a glimpse into an ancient, violent biology that doesn't care about the survival of the individual host. The genetic structure of Progenitor is what allowed Umbrella to create so many different weapons. Because it's so adaptable, they could splice it with almost anything to get a different result. But even after decades of research, so they never truly tamed the original strain. It remained an unpredictable force that could liquefy a host just as easily as it could grant them strength. It's the ultimate biological gamble, where the house always wins and the players usually pay with their lives. Part 2. The Sonnentreppe. The flower that carried the virus and why it only grew in one place on Earth. The virus doesn't just exist in the air or the water. It's hosted by a rare flower known as the Sonnentreppe, which translates to the stairway to the sun. This plant is only found in one specific location on Earth. It grows in a subterranean garden deep beneath the Kijuju region in Africa. This garden is a niche ecosystem that provides everything the flower needs to thrive. It's a quiet place that held the seeds of a global catastrophe for millions of years. The Sonnentreppe is a sensitive organism. It requires a niche soil composition and specific levels of solar radiation that only exist in that underground altar. If you try to grow it anywhere else, the plant might survive, but it doesn't produce the virus. This made the Garden of the Sun the most valuable patch of land in human history. It was the only place where the raw material for Umbrella's dreams could be harvested. Umbrella spent years trying to solve the cultivation problem. They tried to replicate the African soil in their European labs, but it never worked. The virus was tied to the land itself in a way they couldn't replicate. This forced the company to maintain a permanent, secretive presence in Kijuju to guard the source. They couldn't just take the seeds and go home. They had to own the garden if they wanted to own the future. The flower's role as a viral host is a natural mystery. It's unclear how the relationship started, or how long the Sonnentreppe has been carrying Progenitor. For the ancient people who lived there, the flower was a sacred object. It was a gift from the sun that carried a terrible power. To Umbrella, it was just a raw material that needed to be extracted and refined. They didn't care about the sanctity of the garden, only the potency of the extract. This physical limitation is why the African facility remained the heart of the company's research. Even as labs opened in Raccoon City and Antarctica, they all depended on the shipments coming from the underground garden. The flower was the bottleneck. Without a steady supply of Sonnentreppe, the entire T-Virus program would have ground to a halt. It was the biological anchor for a global conspiracy that stretched across every continent. Part 3, the Ndipaya and the King. Selection. How an entire civilization was built around surviving the virus. The ancient Ndipaya tribe built their entire culture around the power of the flower. They were the original guardians of the garden, and they understood the virus better than any modern scientist at the time. Their society wasn't built on money or land, but on the ability to survive the infection. They saw the Sonnentreppe as a divine trial. Only the strongest were allowed to consume it, and only the survivors were allowed to lead. Their king's selection ritual was a brutal example of natural selection. Candidates for leadership would eat the flower and wait for the results. For the vast majority, the ritual ended in a painful death. But for the rare few who survived, the reward was superhuman strength and extreme longevity. These survivors became the Sun Kings, rulers who could live for centuries and protect the tribe from any threat. It was a civilization built on the edge of a biological cliff. The death rate for this ritual was estimated at 99%. It was a gamble that most people would never take. But for the Ndipaya, it was the only way to ensure their survival. They lived in harmony with the virus for generations, treating it with a level of respect that Umbrella would eventually ignore. They knew that the flower wasn't a toy. It was a fundamental force of nature that demanded a blood sacrifice for every gift it gave. When Oswell Spencer first learned about the Ndipaya rituals, he didn't see a primitive tribe. He saw a proof of concept. He realized that if a handful of tribal warriors could adapt to the virus, then a genetically gifted elite could do the same. The Sun Kings were the blueprint for his vision of a new human race. He wanted to take the Ndipaya's ancient tradition and turn it into a global standard for excellence. The Ndipaya eventually lost their garden to the founders of Umbrella, but their history remains a warning. They showed that Progenitor could create something superior, but only at a cost that no sane society would ever pay. They were a people who looked into the sun and didn't blink, and they paid for that clarity with their lives. Their ruins in Kijuju are a testament to a world that was destroyed by the very thing that made it powerful. Part 4. What Progenitor does to a host. The vast majority who die, and the rare few who don't. For most people, exposure to the Progenitor virus results in total cellular collapse. It's not a slow process. The virus enters the system and immediately begins to dismantle the host's DNA. The body doesn't know how to react to an architect that speaks an ancient language. Within minutes, the cellular membranes begin to dissolve. The host literally liquefies as their internal structures fail. It's a violent, messy end for anyone who isn't a perfect match. Massive organ failure is the primary cause of death for the incompatible. The heart, lungs, and brain are overwhelmed by the rapid mutations the virus tries to force. It's like trying to run a high-voltage current through a thin wire. The system simply melts. This lethality is why the virus remained hidden for so long. It kills too fast to spread naturally in a modern population. It needs a lab to slow it down, or a host that's built to take the heat. However, in the rare compatible hosts, the results are the opposite. The virus doesn't destroy, it enhances. It rewrites the nervous system to be faster and more efficient. It increases muscle density until the host is capable of shattering stone. It grants a regenerative healing factor that can close wounds in seconds. For these few, the virus is a gift that turns them into something more than human. It's the ultimate all-or-nothing biological gamble. Compatibility is a genetic lottery that Umbrella spent billions of dollars trying to rig. They looked for markers that matched the Sun Kings and the Wesker children. They wanted to find the specific thread in human DNA that could bond with the progenitor strain without snapping. But even with all their technology, they never fully understood why one person survived while 1,000 others died. It remained a mystery of the blood. This binary outcome is what made the virus so terrifying. There's no middle ground with Progenitor. You either become a god, or you become a puddle of black sludge on the floor. There's no vaccine and no treatment once the process starts. It's a fundamental change that happens at the most basic level of your existence. You're either the king, or you're the soil he walks on, and the virus is the only judge that matters. Section 2. Discovery and Theft. Part 5. The 1966 Expedition. How Spencer, Marcus, and Ashford found the Garden of the Sun. The 1966 expedition was the moment the world changed, even if nobody knew it yet. Oswell Spencer, James Marcus, and Brandon Bailey travelled to West Africa to find the fabled Garden of the Sun. They were following the Natural History Survey, written by Henry Travis, a man whose work had been dismissed as fantasy for years. But Spencer saw the truth in those pages. He knew that if the Sonnentreppe existed, it would be the key to his vision for a new world. On December 4th, 1966, they finally found the Ndipaya ruins. It wasn't an easy victory. The tribe fought to protect their sacred garden with a ferocity that surprised the explorers. But the expedition had superior firepower and a cold determination that the Ndipaya couldn't match. They secured the flowers and realized they had found exactly what they were looking for. They held the future of human evolution in their hands, and they weren't planning on sharing it. The founders were a strange mix of ambition and intellect. Spencer provided the drive, Marcus provided the scientific genius, and Edward Ashford provided the funding and the prestige. Together, they represented the perfect storm of corporate and academic power. They saw the virus as a resource to be exploited, not a sacred gift to be guarded. For them, the garden was just the first step in a plan that would span the next 40 years. Securing the garden was only the beginning of their problems. They had to figure out how to transport the flowers and how to keep them alive in a different climate. They didn't yet realize that the virus was tied to the soil of Kijuju. They thought they could just take the plants back to Europe and start their new world in a comfortable lab. It was an arrogant mistake that would cost them years of progress and lead to the formation of Umbrella as we know it. The expedition proved that the founders were willing to commit any crime to get what they wanted. They displaced an entire civilization and stole a biological legacy for their own gain. This wasn't a mission of discovery. It was a mission of theft. The Progenitor Virus was liberated from the dark, but it was immediately placed into the hands of men who were more dangerous than the infection itself. The tragedy of the franchise started with 3 men standing in a garden, looking at a flower and seeing a throne. Part 6. The problem they immediately hit. Why the virus could only be cultivated in its native soil. The founders immediately hit a wall when they tried to grow the Sonnentreppe in Europe. Marcus spent months trying to cultivate the flowers in a controlled environment, but the results were always the same. The plants would grow, but the virus would vanish from their system. It was as if the Sonnentreppe knew it wasn't home. This was the first major setback for the team, and it forced them to rethink their entire strategy. They couldn't just mass-produce the virus in a factory in London. This cultivation wall was a biological mystery that Marcus couldn't solve. He tried changing the light, the water, and the temperature, but the Sonnentreppe remained sterile. The virus was endemic to the Kijuju garden in a way that defied modern botany. This forced Umbrella to maintain a permanent and secretive presence in Africa. They had to build a facility right on top of the ruins to ensure a steady supply of the raw virus. It was a massive logistical nightmare that delayed their research for years. The need for a permanent African base is what led to the formation of the Kijuju Research Center. It became a fortress designed to protect the source of the company's power. Thousands of workers and scientists were cycled through that facility, all dedicated to the extraction and stabilization of the progenitor strain. They had to ship the raw material across the ocean in specialized containers, hoping that the virus wouldn't degrade before it reached the labs in Raccoon City. Extraction became the primary focus of the early research. If they couldn't grow the virus in Europe, they had to find a way to take it out of the flower and keep it active in a synthetic medium. This was the birth of modern bioweapon research. They were trying to separate the organism from its natural host, a process that required a level of precision that hadn't been invented yet. It was a slow, frustrating period that tested the patience of the founders. This cultivation problem is why the African garden remained the most important site in the Umbrella network. Even as the company grew into a global pharmaceutical giant, they never found a way to bypass the flower. The Sonnentreppe was the only true source. This vulnerability was one of the company's biggest secrets. They spent billions of dollars to ensure that nobody else ever found the underground garden, knowing that their entire empire was built on a single sensitive plant in West Africa. Part 7. The 3 founders and 3 different visions. What each man wanted to do with what they found. The 3 founders of Umbrella were held together by a shared discovery, but they were driven by 3 very different visions. Oswell Spencer was the most dangerous of the group. He didn't care about science for the sake of knowledge. He wanted to use the Progenitor Virus to become a god and lead a new master race. He saw the current human population as a failed experiment that needed to be replaced. For him, the virus was a tool for a global eugenics program that would put him at the top of the food chain. James Marcus was a different kind of monster. He was a pure scientist who was obsessed with the biological potential of the virus. He didn't care about ruling the world. He wanted to understand how life worked at its most fundamental level. He saw the virus as a masterpiece of nature that needed to be unlocked. His curiosity was cold and clinical, leading him to treat human subjects as nothing more than test tubes for his experiments. He was a man who would burn the world just to see what the ashes looked like under a microscope. Edward Ashford was the outlier. He was a nobleman who believed that the progenitor virus could be used for the benefit of humanity. He wanted to explore the regenerative properties of the strain to cure genetic diseases and extend human life. He was the only one with a moral compass, even if that compass was slightly skewed by his own ambition. He saw the potential for a new age of medicine, a vision that put him in direct conflict with Spencer's darker goals. These conflicting egos defined the internal politics of Umbrella from day one. The company wasn't a united front. It was a three-way war for control of the future. Spencer used his political connections to sideline Ashford, while Marcus retreated into his research at the training facility. They were constantly plotting against each other, looking for ways to steal data or sabotage experiments. It was a toxic environment where betrayal was the only constant. This foundation of distrust is what eventually led to the company's collapse. They were so focused on their own visions that they couldn't see the danger they were creating. Spencer eventually had Marcus murdered, and Ashford died in a suspicious research accident. The dream of a new world was buried under a pile of corporate secrets and personal grudges. They found the key to evolution, but they were too human to ever use it properly. They were three men who wanted to be gods, and they ended up as the architects of their own destruction. Part 8. Umbrella Pharmaceuticals. The front company built specifically to fund progenitor research. Umbrella Pharmaceuticals was established in 1968, but it was never intended to be a successful drug company. From the very beginning, it was a massive financial laundering operation. The founders needed a way to funnel billions of dollars into their illegal progenitor research without attracting the attention of the government. Every aspirin and cough syrup sold by Umbrella was just a way to pay for the labs hidden beneath the Raccoon City forest. It was a corporate front on a scale the world had never seen. The company's public face was one of health and safety. They built hospitals, funded schools, and became a cornerstone of the global economy. They were the brand people trusted with their children's lives. But behind the blue and white umbrella logo, they were building monsters. The profits from their legitimate business were used to buy the silence of politicians and the loyalty of mercenaries. They turned the entire city of Raccoon into a company town, and a laboratory where the residents were the unwitting test subjects. This dual nature of the company allowed them to operate with total impunity for decades. If a researcher disappeared or an experiment went wrong, they had the resources to make the problem go away. They owned the police, the media, and the local government. They created a world where Umbrella was the only authority that mattered. It was a perfect system of control, built on the back of a harmless pharmaceutical company. They hid their darkest secrets in plain sight, knowing that nobody would ever look for a biological weapon inside a bottle of cold medicine. The Raccoon City facility was the crown jewel of this operation. Known as Nest, it was a state-of-the-art laboratory buried deep underground. It was where the progenitor research was refined into the T-Virus, and where the first bioorganic weapon, first use assets were produced. The facility was designed to be completely self-sufficient, a world within a world where the laws of ethics didn't apply. It was the heart of the conspiracy, a place where the founders' visions were finally given a physical form. Umbrella's success was its ultimate downfall. They grew so large and so powerful that they became arrogant. They believed they were untouchable, and they ignored the warning signs of a system that was beginning to fail. The very front they built to protect their research eventually became the cage that trapped them. When the truth finally came out, the company collapsed under the weight of its own lies. But for 30 years, they were the masters of the world, a pharmaceutical giant that was secretly a factory for the apocalypse. Section 3. Early Research and the First Dead Ends. Part 9. Ashford's Direction. The push toward genetic medicine and why it was the first path abandoned. After the company was founded, Edward Ashford focused his energy on using the Progenitor Virus for genetic medicine. He was convinced that the regenerative properties seen in the Sun Kings could be tamed to cure a variety of human illnesses. He launched a series of projects designed to isolate the healing markers within the strain. He wanted to build a world where disability and disease were things of the past. It was a noble goal, but it was built on a foundation of liquid death that he didn't fully understand. The problem Ashford immediately ran into was the virus's inherent lethality. See, no matter how much he diluted the strain, or how carefully he prepared the host, the results were always the same. The Progenitor Virus was too aggressive to be used as a simple medicine. It didn't want to heal, it wanted to rewrite. Every time he tried to use it to fix a genetic defect, the virus simply destroyed the host's cells. It was like trying to use a blowtorch to perform surgery. The tool was too powerful for the task. Once Oswell Spencer realized that Ashford's peaceful research wasn't producing the results he wanted, he began to sideline the project. Spencer had no interest in curing the sick. He wanted to replace them. He saw Ashford's medicine as a waste of time and resources. He began to cut the funding for the genetic research and redirected the best scientists to the military application labs. He wanted weapons and gods, not patients and doctors. Ashford's vision for a better world was being systematically erased by a man who only cared about power. Ashford's failure to tame the virus was the first major dead end in Umbrella's history. It proved that the progenitor strain was fundamentally incompatible with civilian medicine. It couldn't be controlled or predicted in its pure form. This realization shifted the company's focus permanently toward weaponization. If they couldn't use the virus to save lives, they would use it to end them. The peaceful path was abandoned, and the company fully committed to the path of biological warfare. The loss of the medical direction was a turning point for the founders. Without the balance of Ashford's humanitarian goals, the company became a pure engine of destruction. They stopped looking for cures and started looking for ways to maximize the infection rate. Ashford's research was buried in the archives, a reminder of a future that never happened. He tried to turn the stairway to the sun into a ladder for humanity, but he ended up just building another floor in Spencer's House of Horrors. Part 10. Ashford's death in 1968. What happened and what it removed from the research. Edward Ashford died in 1968, shortly after the founding of the company. Officially, it was a research accident involving a leak of the Progenitor Virus. But in the world of Umbrella, an accident is rarely just an accident. His death was extremely convenient for Oswell Spencer. It removed the only person who could challenge Spencer's authority and redirect the company's resources. With Edward gone, the moral compass of the founders was shattered, and the company was free to pursue its darkest ambitions without any internal resistance. Edward's death left his son, Alexander Ashford, in a weakened and desperate position. Alexander lacked his father's prestige and his political influence. He was a man who felt the weight of his family's legacy, but didn't have the strength to carry it. Spencer used this vulnerability to seize total control of Umbrella's direction. He effectively exiled the Ashfords to their remote facilities in Antarctica and Rockfort Island, keeping them out of the way while he built his empire in Raccoon City. The Ashford name became a relic of the past, a shadow of what it once was. The loss of Edward Ashford meant the end of the medical research program. There was nobody left to advocate for the peaceful use of the progenitor strain. The company became a pure reflection of Spencer's eugenics vision. Every lab and every experiment was now focused on the creation of a master race and the weaponization of the virus. The death of one man changed the fate of the entire world, as it allowed the most dangerous founder to take the wheel without any brakes. The details of the accident that killed Edward remain classified and highly suspicious. Some files suggest that the containment breach was intentional, a calculated move by Spencer to eliminate his rival. Whether it was murder or a tragedy, the result was the same. The one man who might have kept Umbrella from becoming a monster was silenced. His death was the catalyst for the global bioterror era that followed, as it removed the last barrier between the virus and the men who wanted to use it to burn the world. Edward Ashford's death is a reminder of how fragile the balance of power was in the early days of Umbrella. It was a company built on a foundation of betrayal and secrets. Even before the first zombie was created, the founders were already killing each other. Edward died believing he could save the world, but he ended up just providing the fuel for its destruction. He was a dreamer who was outplayed by a man who didn't dream, but planned. His legacy was a family that went mad trying to reclaim the glory he lost. Spencer believed that the current human race was obsolete. He saw the wars, the poverty, and the disease of the 20th century as proof that humanity had reached its natural limit. He wanted to use the Progenitor Virus to force a global evolutionary leap. He launched Project W, a highly secretive program designed to find and raise a generation of superior children. These candidates were selected for their high intelligence and their physical potential. They were given the best education and the best training, all while being monitored for their compatibility with the virus. The Wesker children were the center of this project. They were given the name of the researcher who led the program, but they were Spencer's creations. He wanted to build a world where only the super-intelligent and the virus-compatible survived. He saw the coming outbreak as a necessary cull, a way to clear the planet of the weak and make room for his new gods. He wasn't just building a company, he was building a religion with himself as the architect. He wanted to be the father of a new humanity that didn't know the limits of the old one. Project W was a massive operation that spanned several continents. Hundreds of children were abducted or purchased and placed into specialized facilities. They were treated like high-end assets, raised in a controlled environment to ensure they met Spencer's standards. Most of them died during the final stage of the project, when they were injected with a variant of the progenitor strain. Only 2 were known to have survived with their full faculties, Albert and Alex Wesker. For Spencer, This was enough to prove that his vision was possible. This eugenics vision is what drove every decision Spencer made for Umbrella. He didn't care about the profit from the drugs or the effectiveness of the bioweapons. Those were just means to an end. He wanted a world where he was the immortal ruler of a perfect race. He saw the T-Virus as a screening tool, a way to find the rare individuals who were worthy of the future. The horror of Raccoon City wasn't a failure to him. It was a field test for the great filtering of the human race. Spencer's vision was a peak example of corporate arrogance. He believed he had the right to decide who lived and who died based on a genetic lottery. He turned the Progenitor Virus into a weapon of mass selection. He spent his life and his fortune trying to build a world that would never accept him, a world that was too cold and too logical for a frail old man. He wanted to be a god, but he ended up just being a ghost in a machine he could no longer control. He was the architect of a nightmare that eventually consumed him. Part 12. Marcus takes the lead. The decision to focus on weaponization over medicine. While Spencer was focused on his eugenics vision, James Marcus moved his research to the Arklay training facility. Marcus was a man who had grown tired of the corporate politics and the administrative demands of the main office. He wanted to return to the laboratory and focus on the biological potential of the progenitor strain. He realized that the virus was too lethal for Spencer's dream of a new human race. But instead of seeing that as a failure, Marcus saw it as an opportunity. He pivoted the research toward weaponization, realizing that a virus that kills everyone it touches is the perfect weapon. Marcus became the lead architect of the company's early bioorganic weapon program. He understood that if they couldn't make the virus stable for a host, they could use its destructive nature to create tactical assets. He started experimenting with local wildlife and human subjects to see how the virus could be used to create creatures that were stronger and more aggressive. He didn't care about a master race. He wanted a master predator. He was the one who turned the training facility into a factory for the first generation of Umbrella's horrors. The decision to focus on weaponization was a major shift for the company. It opened up a new market for their research. They could sell the virus and the creatures it created to governments and private militaries. This provided the massive amounts of cash that Spencer needed to fund his more ambitious projects. Marcus was the one who proved that the Progenitor Virus was a viable product. He turned a biological curiosity into a global industry, a move that ensured Umbrella would stay at the center of the world's power for decades. Marcus's research at the training facility was done in almost total isolation. He didn't trust Spencer or the other executives, and he kept his most important findings to himself. He was a man who felt the weight of his own genius and didn't want anyone else to claim his work. This secrecy only fueled the tension within the company. Spencer knew that Marcus was making breakthroughs, but he didn't have access to the data. This conflict of interest eventually led to the betrayal that would end Marcus's life and change the course of the T-Virus project. The shift toward weaponization was the final nail in the coffin for any hope of a peaceful future for the virus. Marcus showed that the most profitable way to use Progenitor was to kill with it. He turned the science of evolution into the science of mass murder. Every zombie and every tyrant that followed was a direct result of his decision to stop looking for a cure and start looking for a better way to destroy. He was the one who gave the virus its teeth, and he did it with a clinical indifference that was more terrifying than any of his creations. Part 13. The Arklay Training Facility, where Marcus took the research and what he was really doing. The Arklay Training Facility became a place of silence and dread under the leadership of James Marcus. It was located deep in the mountains, far from the prying eyes of the public and even the other umbrella departments. Marcus became a recluse, rarely leaving his private labs and spending his days in the company of his experiments. He began to distrust the corporate spies that Spencer sent to watch him, and he turned the facility into his own private kingdom. It was here that the first truly dark chapters of the Umbrella story were written. Marcus began experimenting on his own students and the local wildlife of the Arklay Mountains. He saw the young recruits as a convenient source of fresh genetic material. If a student failed their exams or showed signs of dissent, they would often disappear into the basement labs. He didn't see them as people. He saw them as data points. He recorded their reactions to the progenitor strain with a cold, analytical eye, watching as their bodies were torn apart by the mutations. He was a man who had lost all touch with his own humanity. During this period, Marcus became obsessed with leeches. He noted that their simple genetic structure was remarkably resilient to the corrosive nature of the Progenitor Virus. Unlike human subjects, who would often liquefy within minutes, the leeches could host the virus for extended periods. They would grow larger and more aggressive, showing a level of intelligence that was unnatural for their species. Marcus saw this as a breakthrough. He realized that the leeches could be used as a bridge to stabilize the virus for more complex hosts. His relationship with the leeches was more than just scientific. It was almost spiritual. He began to see them as his true children, the only things that understood the beauty of the virus he had discovered. He would talk to them in his lab, sharing his secrets and his frustrations with a company that didn't appreciate his genius. The leeches became the focus of all his research. He spent years trying to find the exact combination of leech DNA and progenitor material that would produce a stable, contagious weapon. The work at the Arklay training facility was the foundation for everything that followed. It was where the first successful progenitor derivative was born. Marcus was the one who did the hard and dirty work of turning a prehistoric organism into a tactical asset. He worked in the dark, surrounded by the screams of his students and the wet sounds of his leeches, driven by a cold ambition that would eventually lead to his own murder. He was the first one to realize that the virus was a living thing that demanded a relationship, and he was the first one to pay the price for that realization. Part 14, Leech DNA as the bridge. How Marcus solved the lethality problem in January 1978. January 19th, 1978 stands as the most significant date in the history of the mountain facility. After years of failure, James Marcus finally found the bridge he needed to stabilize the progenitor strain. He realized that the virus was too aggressive for human hosts, because it tried to rewrite too much too quickly. He needed a genetic buffer, a simple and resilient organism that could absorb the initial shock of the infection. He found that buffer in the common leech, a creature whose basic biology proved capable of hosting the ancient organism without immediate collapse. The leeches were a calculated choice by Marcus because of their uncomplicated nervous systems. This simplicity allowed the virus to settle without causing the total cellular failure seen in more complex mammals. By bonding the progenitor material with leech DNA, Marcus created a derivative that was far more stable. This new agent did not try to force an immediate evolution. Instead, it focused on the preservation of basic motor functions and physical durability. It was the birth of the T-Virus, the agent that would eventually define the Umbrella era. This breakthrough changed the entire direction of the research at the training facility. Marcus stopped looking for a master race and started looking for a master weapon. He saw that the T-Virus could keep a host functional long after their brain had died, a trait that had immense military value. He began to refine the process, using the leeches as living factories to produce the new strain. The facility became a hive of activity as Marcus worked to perfect the bond between the virus and the host's central nervous system. The leeches themselves began to change under the influence of the new virus. They grew larger and displayed a collective intelligence that defied their natural instincts. They became a physical manifestation of Marcus's success, a group of predators that shared a link with their creator. Marcus saw them as his true children, the first successful results of his life's work. He spent his days in the dark labs, surrounded by the wet sounds of his experiments, oblivious to the corporate storm gathering outside his walls. The T-Virus was a victory of science over nature, but it was a hollow one. It traded the dream of human evolution for the reality of reanimation. It was not the God-making agent that Spencer wanted, but it was something far more profitable. It was a weapon that could be manufactured and deployed on a global scale. Marcus knew he had changed the world, but he did not realize he had also signed his own death warrant. The success of the T-Virus made him too valuable to control and too dangerous to keep alive. The stability provided by the leeches allowed for the first consistent testing on human subjects. Marcus no longer had to worry about his volunteers liquefying in minutes. He could watch the infection take hold over hours and days, recording the slow decay of the higher brain. This data was the foundation for the entire bioorganic weapon industry. Without the humble leech, the T-Virus would have remained a lethal curiosity in an African cave. Marcus had bridged the gap, and in doing so, he had opened the door to the apocalypse. Part 15. What the T-Virus was. The first successful progenitor, derivative, and what it could do. The T-Virus, or tyrant virus, was the first successful derivative of the progenitor strain that could be reliably deployed. Its primary function was to trade the complex evolution of the original virus for a simpler form of reanimation. When the T-Virus enters a host, it attacks the brain first, causing a massive inflammatory response. This leads to the death of the higher brain functions, including memory, personality, and morality. The host is reduced to a collection of basic instincts, driven entirely by a metabolic hunger that cannot be satisfied. While the higher brain dies, the T-Virus keeps the motor cortex and the nervous system active. This allows the host to remain mobile even after clinical death has occurred. This reanimation is what creates the zombie, the most famous byproduct of the umbrella research. The virus provides the energy needed to keep the muscles moving and the heart pumping at a minimal level. It turns a human being into a persistent biological machine that exists only to spread the infection to new hosts. It was the perfect self-propagating weapon. The ultimate goal of the T-Virus was not to create zombies, but to create stable BOW assets like the Tyrant. The zombies were seen as a failure of compatibility, the result of a body that could not handle the full potential of the strain. Researchers looked for the rare individuals who could maintain their intelligence while gaining the physical upgrades of the virus. These compatible hosts were the only way to produce the high-level soldiers that Spencer craved. The T-Virus was a screening tool as much as it was a weapon, filtering the population for the genetically gifted. The physical changes caused by the T-Virus are extensive and grotesque. The skin begins to rot because the body's repair systems are focused entirely on the nervous system. The metabolism of the host accelerates, leading to the cannibalistic behavior seen in outbreaks. The virus forces the body to consume its own tissue if it cannot find external food, leading to the gaunt, decayed appearance of the infected. It is a slow, agonizing process that turns the miracle of life into a mechanical horror. The T-virus also has the ability to jump between species with terrifying ease. It can infect dogs, crows, spiders, and even plants, creating a web of mutation that can consume an entire ecosystem in weeks. This versatility is what made it such a high-priority asset for the military. It did not just kill the enemy. It turned the environment itself into a weapon. The T-virus was the first realization of Marcus's vision of a master predator, a viral agent that could rewrite the world in its own image. Umbrella marketed the T-virus as a surgical weapon, but in reality, it was a biological wildfire. Once it was released, there was no way to stop the spread without a total sanitization of the area. It represented a shift in the philosophy of warfare, where the goal was no longer to conquer territory, but to erase it. The T-virus was the physical proof that the progenitor discovery could be tamed, even if that taming resulted in a world of monsters. It was the flagship product of a company that had traded its soul for a better way to kill. Part 16. Marcus Murdered. How Spencer had him killed in 1988 and his research handed to Birkin and Wesker. By 1988, James Marcus had become a liability to Oswell Spencer. Marcus was the only one who held the secrets to the original T-virus breakthrough, and his growing instability made him difficult to manage. He had retreated into his training facility, refusing to share his data with the main office, and treating the corporate executives with open contempt. Spencer knew that he could not achieve his eugenics vision as long as Marcus controlled the primary research. He decided that the time had come to eliminate his old partner and take the T-virus for himself. Spencer sent an assassination squad to the Arklay facility to carry out the deed. The squad was led by two of Marcus's own protégés, a young Albert Wesker and a brilliant William Birkin. They were the rising stars of the company, and they saw Marcus's death as the only way to advance their own careers. On a cold night in 1988, they cornered Marcus in his lab and gunned him down. As he lay dying, he watched as the two men he had trained stole his life's work. They dumped his body into the facility's sewer system, believing the secret was buried forever. The murder of Marcus was a turning point in the internal politics of Umbrella. It marked the end of the founders' era and the beginning of the era of the researchers. Spencer handed Marcus's notes and viral samples over to Birkin and Wesker, tasking them with refining the T-virus for mass production. They moved the operation to the newly built laboratory beneath Raccoon City, leaving the Arklay facility to rot. The betrayal was complete, and the company was now a pure reflection of Spencer's will, with no one left to challenge his authority. Birkin and Wesker used Marcus's foundation to launch a new wave of biological horror. They were younger, more ambitious, and less restrained by the academic traditions of the past. They saw the T-virus as a starting point rather than a goal. Birkin, in particular, was obsessed with finding a way to move past the limitations of the T strain. He used the stolen data to begin his work on the G-virus, a project that would eventually lead to the destruction of the very city that housed his lab. The death of Marcus was the spark that lit the fuse for the Raccoon City disaster. The murder also had an unexpected biological consequence. As Marcus's body lay in the sewers, his beloved leeches found him. The queen leech, which had been infected with the most potent strain of his T-virus, merged with his remains. Over the next 10 years, the virus would slowly rebuild Marcus's form, fueled by the genetic data of the leeches and the rage of a dead man. He would eventually return to seek revenge on the company that betrayed him, but for a decade, Spencer believed he had won. He had traded a partner for a weapon, and he felt the price was worth it. This act of corporate murder proved that Umbrella was a predator that ate its own. Spencer was willing to kill his oldest friend to secure his vision of godhood. The company was built on a foundation of blood, and it was only fitting that its greatest breakthrough was baptized in the murder of its creator. Birkin and Wesker became the architects of the next decade of horror, using the stolen genius of a dead man to build a world of monsters. They were the new face of Umbrella, a face that was cold, efficient, and completely devoid of human empathy. Section 5. The Derivatives. Part 17. The T-Virus family. Every strain. Birkin developed from Marcus's foundation. After the death of Marcus, William Birkin took the lead in refining the T-Virus into a variety of specialized strains. He was not content with the simple reanimation of the original Z strain. He wanted to create the ultimate soldier, a creature that could follow orders and dominate a battlefield. This led to the development of the Epsilon strain, which became the standard for Umbrella's high-level BOW production. It was the Epsilon strain that was used to create the T-002 Tyrant, the creature that would eventually face the STARS team in the Arklay mansion. Birkin's research focused on the concept of compatibility. He realized that the vast majority of humans were genetically incompatible with the T-Virus, leading to the zombie failure. He spent years trying to increase the percentage of hosts who could adapt to the virus without losing their intelligence. He created thousands of substrains, testing them on a variety of subjects to see which one offered the best balance of power and control. His work was a desperate attempt to find the 1 in a million host that Spencer required for his new world order. The T-Virus family grew to include strains designed for specific environments and tactical needs. There were strains developed for aquatic environments, leading to the creation of the Neptune project. There were strains designed for speed and agility, producing the Hunter series of predators. Every monster that the STARS team encountered in '98 was a different branch of Birkin's refined T-Virus tree. He had taken Marcus's bridge and built a massive industrial complex on top of it, turning a single breakthrough into a global catalogue of death. One of the most dangerous branches was the beta strain, which focused on increasing the infectiousness of the virus. Birkin wanted to create an agent that could spread through a city in hours, making it impossible for the authorities to contain. This research was the direct cause of the Raccoon City outbreak. The virus was designed to be a wildfire, and once it was released, it performed exactly as Birkin had intended. He had created a weapon that was too efficient for its own good. A virus that could erase a city before a cure could even be discussed. Birkin also experimented with combining the T-Virus with other biological agents. He looked at plant DNA, insect genomes, and even ancient parasites to see how they could enhance the viral effects. This led to the creation of the Plant 42 and the giant spiders found in the Arklay ruins. He was a man who saw the entire natural world as a collection of parts that could be reassembled into something more lethal. He was the master of the T-Virus family, a scientist who had turned the study of life into the study of extinction. The legacy of Birkin's strains continued long after the fall of Umbrella. The data he gathered was sold on the black market to various terror groups and private militaries. The T-Virus was the most widely used biological weapon in history, a testament to Birkin's success in making it a functional product. He had finished what Marcus started, but he had also ensured that the world would never be free of the virus. The T-Virus family was his gift to the future, a family that was destined to inherit the Earth through violence and mutation. Part 18, the G virus, how Lisa Trevor's body accidentally produced the most dangerous progenitor derivative ever. In 1988, while William Birkin was refining the T-Virus, he made a discovery that would change the course of biological history. He found a new, highly aggressive agent inside the body of Lisa Trevor. Lisa had been a human test subject for Umbrella since 1967, a girl who had spent 20 years being injected with every progenitor variant the company produced. Her body possessed a unique genetic elasticity that allowed her to survive the infections that killed everyone else. She had become a living cauldron, where the different strains were allowed to mix and mutate. The result of this 20-year experiment was the G virus, or the Golgotha virus. Unlike the T virus, which was a calculated scientific creation, the G virus was a biological accident. It was a spontaneous mutation that occurred within Lisa's cells, as her body fought to survive the constant viral onslaught. Birkin realized that G was fundamentally different from T. While the T virus caused a set of predictable mutations, the G virus allowed for infinite, non-linear evolution. It did not just rewrite the DNA, it turned the host into an engine of constant change. The G virus is the most dangerous progenitor derivative because it does not require a laboratory to evolve. Once a host is infected with G, their body begins to mutate in real time, responding to external threats and internal damage by growing new limbs, eyes, and defensive structures. It is a process of natural selection accelerated into seconds. Sheer G host can be blown apart and still rebuild themselves into a larger, more powerful form. It is the ultimate expression of the progenitor dream, an organism that can adapt to any environment and survive any attack. Birkin was obsessed with the G virus because he saw it as the true path to human evolution. He believed that if he could control the G mutations, he could create a race of immortal, self-repairing gods. He spent the next 10 years working in his secret lab beneath Raccoon City, trying to stabilize the G strain. He kept the project a secret from Spencer for as long as he could, wanting to keep the power for himself. He saw G as his masterpiece, the one thing that would make him more than just a corporate researcher. The primary drawback of the G virus is that it is almost impossible for a host to maintain their intelligence. The constant mutation is so taxing on the brain that the host quickly loses their humanity, becoming a mass of eyes and teeth. The virus also has a desperate need to reproduce, seeking out genetic matches to create G progeny. If a match cannot be found, the host will forcibly implant a parasite into a victim, leading to a violent and lethal rejection. It is a virus that consumes everything it touches, leaving no room for the original person. The discovery of the G virus was the final proof that the progenitor strain was a gateway to chaos. Birkin had found a way to unlock the true power of the ancient organism, but he could not control the results. The G virus was the monster that even Umbrella was afraid of. When Birkin finally injected himself during the Raccoon City incident, he became a physical record of his own failure. He was the architect of the most dangerous virus ever made, and he died as a mindless slave to its infinite, destructive hunger. Part 19. T-Veronica. How Alexia Ashford took a completely different route, with the same source material. While Birkin was working on the G virus in Raccoon City, Alexia Ashford was pursuing a completely different path in the Antarctic facility. Alexia was a child prodigy who had been created through the Project W experiment, a plan to clone the intelligence of the family matriarch, Veronica Ashford. Alexia saw the T virus as a crude and unrefined tool. She believed that the burn of the progenitor strain was too fast for the human host to handle. So she wanted to find a way to let the virus and the host bond slowly over time, creating a true symbiosis. Alexia developed the T-Veronica strain by splicing progenitor material with ant DNA and ancient genes. She was fascinated by the social structure of ants and the absolute control the queen had over the colony. She wanted to create a virus that would grant her that same level of authority. The ant DNA provided the foundation for a hive mind, while the progenitor base provided the superhuman power. It was a sophisticated, elegant approach to biological warfare that was far ahead of anything Birkin or Wesker were doing at the time. The key to the T-Veronica breakthrough was the use of cryostasis. Alexia realized that if she were injected with the virus and then frozen, the cold would slow down the viral activity. This would allow her cells to slowly integrate the new genetic material over a period of 15 years. Instead of a violent mutation that would destroy her humanity, she would undergo a slow transformation that would preserve her mind. She was willing to give up 15 years of her life to become a true goddess, a sacrifice that showed the depth of her ambition. When Alexia finally emerged from her stasis, she had achieved what no other researcher could. She was a stable, intelligent host for a high-level progenitor derivative. She could control her mutations, manifesting fire-based attacks and a hardened exoskeleton at will. She also held total control over any infected organism within her colony, acting as the queen of a new biological kingdom. The T-Veronica virus was the only project that ever came close to fulfilling Spencer's dream of a stable, superior human race. The tragedy of the T-Veronica project was that it was built on the suffering of her own family. Alexia used her father, Alexander, as the first test subject for the strain. The experiment was a failure, turning him into a mindless, screaming monster known as Nosferatu. She watched his suffering with a cold indifference, using his pain as data to refine her own injection. The Ashford legacy was a story of brilliance and madness, and Alexia was the ultimate expression of that duality. She was a queen who had built her throne on the bodies of her own bloodline. T-Veronica remains one of the most unique branches of the progenitor tree. It showed that the virus could be managed through patience and precision rather than raw force. It was a viral agent that required a relationship with the host, a concept that Marcus had hinted at but could never achieve. While Alexia was eventually defeated, her work proved that the progenitor legacy could produce more than just zombies and tyrants. It could produce a queen, a being that was as beautiful as it was terrifying, and as stable as it was lethal. Part 20. Uroboros. Wesker's attempt to use raw progenitor to force human evolution at a global scale. After the fall of Umbrella, Albert Wesker became the primary keeper of the progenitor legacy. He had survived his own injection and seen the potential of the various derivatives like T, G, and Veronica. But Wesker was not interested in being a corporate researcher or a pawn for Spencer. He wanted to return to the original vision of the African garden. He wanted to use a refined version of the raw progenitor strain to force a global evolutionary event. This project was known as Uroboros, the snake that eats its own tail, representing the end of the old world and the beginning of the new. Uroboros was designed to be the final screening tool for humanity. Wesker used the Ndipaya flower as the base, but added a genetic filter that would check for compatibility in real time. If the host possessed the gifted markers that Spencer had looked for, they would evolve into a superior being. If they were incompatible, the virus would react violently, consuming the host and turning them into a mass of black, worm-like cysts. Wesker's plan was to release Uroboros into the atmosphere, killing billions of obsolete humans and leaving only the chosen few to follow him. The virus was a direct return to the all-or-nothing gamble of the Ndipaya rituals. It was a way to automate the king selection process on a global scale. Wesker saw himself as the new Sun King, the one who would lead the survivors into a new era of biological perfection. He did not care about the casualties. He saw them as a necessary cleansing of the planet. Uroboros was the ultimate eugenics weapon, a viral agent that carried the ego of a man who believed he had already become a god. The physical manifestation of the Uroboros failure was a nightmare of black tentacles. The virus was so aggressive that it would grow outside the body, seeking out any nearby organic matter to consume. An incompatible host would be buried under a mountain of thrashing, parasitic worms within seconds. This was the filtering process in action, a visceral record of a host that was not worthy of the future. Wesker believed that this chaos was a beautiful part of the natural order, a way for the virus to reclaim the planet from the weak. Wesker's plan for Uroboros was the peak of the progenitor obsession. He had taken the research back to its roots in Kijuju, using the very facility where the founders had started their journey. He was the one who finally solved the problem of weaponizing the pure strain, even if his solution resulted in a world of black sludge. He was a man who had spent his entire life in the shadow of Spencer's dream, and Uroboros was his attempt to finally step out of that shadow and claim the throne for himself. The defeat of Wesker in Africa marked the end of the Uroboros threat, but the virus remained a symbol of the ultimate danger. It showed that as long as the progenitor strain existed, someone would try to use it to play God. Uroboros was the closest the world ever came to a total biological reset, a plan that was as logical as it was insane. It was the final chapter in the story of the Africa Garden, a story that started with a flower and almost ended with the extinction of the human race. Part 21, T-Phobos and the Post-Umbrella Derivatives. What happened to progenitor research after the company fell? Even after the collapse of Umbrella and the death of its founders, the progenitor research continued to poison the world. The data was scattered across the globe, falling into the hands of organizations like the Connections and various national militaries. These groups were not interested in Spencer's master race. They wanted tactical weapons that could be used for specific goals. This led to the creation of post-umbrella derivatives like T-Phobos and the C-Virus. These strains were remixes of the original work, designed for a modern world of black market bioterrorism. The T-Phobos virus, developed by Alex Wesker on Same Island, was a unique branch that reacted to the host's adrenaline and fear levels. It was a psychological weapon as much as a biological one. If the host could manage their fear, they could remain human. But if they panicked, the virus would trigger a violent mutation. This was a refined version of the screening concept, using the host's mental state as the filter for compatibility. It was a cold, cruel experiment that showed how the progenitor legacy had evolved into a tool for torture and control. The C-Virus was another major post-umbrella agent, used in the global outbreaks of 2012. It was a hybrid strain that combined the mutational properties of the G-Virus with the stability of the T-Veronica strain. The result was a virus that could produce a variety of specialized mutations, from the Javo soldiers to the massive building-sized BOW assets. The C-Virus proved that the science of Marcus and Birkin was still the foundation for every new disaster. The world was simply finding new ways to package the same ancient horror. The Connections, the syndicate responsible for the mold, and the E-Series also had ties to the progenitor research. They were the ones who tried to synthesize the Wesker secret into a controllable product. They saw the virus as a commodity, a high-value asset that could be sold to the highest bidder. This commercialization of the virus is what defines the current era of Resident Evil. The monsters are no longer the accidents of a mad scientist. They are the products of a global industry that has fully integrated the progenitor strain into its business model. This era of post-Umbrella research shows that the cultivation wall was finally broken. The syndicate found ways to produce the virus without needing the African garden, using synthetic methods and advanced gene editing. This made the threat more decentralized and more difficult to track. The progenitor legacy was no longer tied to a single flower or a single company. It was everywhere, hidden in the digital records of 1,000 labs. The world had become a laboratory, where the experiments never ended and the subjects never had a choice. The long legacy of the progenitor derivatives is a reminder that you cannot, discover a secret. Once the door was opened in 1966, it could never be closed. The world is now a place where the next outbreak is always just a boardroom decision away. Every new strain and every new monster is a testament to the brilliance and the madness of the men who stood in that African garden. They are dead, but their work lives on in the blood of the infected, a permanent part of the human story. Section 6. The virus in its pure form. Part 22. Why pure progenitor was never weaponized. The lethality problem nobody could solve. Throughout the 40-year history of Umbrella, the company never found a way to weaponize the pure progenitor strain for a standard battlefield. They could create derivatives like T and G, but the original organism remained liquid death. The primary reason for this was the lethality problem. Pure progenitor moves through a host too fast, causing total cellular collapse before the infection can spread. In a war zone, a weapon is only effective if it can create a self-sustaining outbreak. Progenitor simply killed its hosts and stayed in the dirt, making it a terrible tactical asset. The virus was also extremely sensitive to the environment outside its native African garden. It would degrade quickly if not kept under very specific conditions, making it impossible to store in a standard missile or grenade. Umbrella scientists spent decades trying to find a stabilizer for the pure strain, but they always ended up creating a new derivative instead. Every attempt to make the virus safer for deployment resulted in a loss of the original evolutionary power. The pure strain was too volatile to be a product and too sensitive to be a weapon. This lethality problem was the reason Marcus had to look for a bridge in the first place. He realized that the pure virus was essentially a prehistoric predator that had no place in the modern world. It did not have the patience to wait for a host to adapt. It simply consumed everything it touched. This raw aggression is what made it so fascinating to the founders. But it was also what made it useless for their corporate goals. They needed a virus that was slow enough to be controlled, and progenitor was never slow. The only way to use pure progenitor was through direct injection in a controlled laboratory setting. This is how the Wesker children and Lisa Trevor were infected. It was a process of surgical precision that could not be replicated on a battlefield. It required a team of doctors, a state-of-the-art facility, and a host with a very specific genetic profile. Even then, the success rate was so low that it was considered a failure by everyone except Spencer. The pure virus was a tool for gods, not a weapon for soldiers. The failure to weaponize the pure strain is what led to the variety of BOW assets we see in the series. The tyrants and the hunters were compromises, the results of a company that had given up on the original dream. They settled for monsters because they could not create gods. The pure progenitor strain remained a legend in the Umbrella archives, a holy grail that was always out of reach. It was the ultimate power that nobody could hold, a prehistoric fire that burned anyone who tried to touch it. This limitation is a testament to the power of the Ndipaya garden. The virus was meant to stay in that altar, protected by the soil and the sun. When humanity tried to drag it into the light of the 20th century, they found that it was too big for their boxes. The lethality problem was nature's way of saying that some things are not meant to be shared. Umbrella's entire history was an attempt to bypass that rule, an attempt that ended in the destruction of everything they had built. Part 23, Lisa, Trevor, the only known human to survive. Pure progenitor, infection, and what her body did with it. Lisa Trevor is the most tragic and important figure in the history of the progenitor research. Injected in 1967 as a child, she was the only human known to have survived a pure progenitor infection for more than a few days. Her body possessed a unique genetic elasticity that allowed her to absorb the viral mutations without dissolving. She was kept in a cell beneath the Arklay mansion for 30 years, a prisoner of a company that saw her as the ultimate human test tube. She was the one who proved that a human could host the ancient fire. Lisa's body became a biological cauldron where Umbrella's various experiments were tested. For 3 decades, she was injected with every strain of the T-Virus and every parasite the company developed. Instead of dying, her body simply integrated the new material, mutation by mutation. She became a grotesque, immortal horror, her mind shattered by the pain and the isolation. She was a living record of Umbrella's sins, a creature that could not die and could not remain human. Her survival was a miracle that Birkin and Wesker used to build their careers. The most significant event in Lisa's life happened in 1988, when Birkin injected her with an experimental parasite. Instead of being consumed, Lisa's body absorbed the parasite and triggered a spontaneous mutation of the progenitor base in her blood. This was the moment the G virus was born. Her body had done what 30 years of science could not. It had evolved the virus into a new form of infinite potential. Lisa was the mother of the G legacy, a girl who had been turned into a factory for the apocalypse. The data gathered from Lisa was the foundation for the entire Tyrant project. Researchers studied how her cells repaired themselves and how her nervous system handled the viral load. They used her blood to create the stabilizers that allowed other hosts to survive the T-virus. Lisa was the key that unlocked the Umbrella era, the one person whose suffering made everything else possible. She was the sacrifice that the founders had demanded, a human life that was ground up to fuel a corporate dream. Despite her power, Lisa remained a prisoner of her own mind. She spent her days searching for her mother, unable to understand that her family had been murdered decades ago. She wore the faces of her victims as a mask, a desperate attempt to find a piece of the humanity she had lost. She was a ghost in a monster's body, a reminder that the progenitor virus does not just change your DNA, it erases your soul. Her death in 98 was a mercy, a final end to a 30-year nightmare. Lisa Trevor is the physical proof of the progenitor's destructive potential. She showed that you could survive the virus, but the price was your identity and your sanity. She was the only progenitor human who was not a part of Spencer's elite circle, a civilian caught in the gears of a global conspiracy. Her story is the heart of the Resident Evil horror, a story of a child who was stolen by a flower and forgotten by a world that was too busy looking at her cells to see her face. Part 14. Leech DNA as the bridge. How Marcus solved the lethality problem in January 1978. January 19th, 1978 stands as the most significant date in the history of the mountain facility. After years of failure, James Marcus finally found the bridge he needed to stabilize the progenitor strain. He realized that the virus was too aggressive for human hosts because it tried to rewrite too much too quickly. He needed a genetic buffer, a simple and resilient organism that could absorb the initial shock of the infection. He found that buffer in the common leech, a creature whose basic biology proved capable of hosting the ancient organism without immediate collapse. The leeches were a calculated choice by Marcus because of their uncomplicated nervous systems. This simplicity allowed the virus to settle without causing the total cellular failure seen in more complex mammals. By bonding the progenitor material with leech DNA, Marcus created a derivative that was far more stable. This new agent did not try to force an immediate evolution. Instead, it focused on the preservation of basic motor functions and physical durability. It was the birth of the T-Virus, the agent that would eventually define the Umbrella era. This breakthrough changed the entire direction of the research at the training facility. Marcus stopped looking for a master race and started looking for a master weapon. He saw that the T-Virus could keep a host functional long after their brain had died, a trait that had immense military value. He began to refine the process, using the leeches as living factories to produce the new strain. The facility became a hive of activity as Marcus worked to perfect the bond between the virus and the host's central nervous system. The leeches themselves began to change under the influence of the new virus. They grew larger and displayed a collective intelligence that defied their natural instincts. They became a physical manifestation of Marcus's success, a group of predators that shared a link with their creator. Marcus saw them as his true children, the first successful results of his life's work. He spent his days in the dark labs, surrounded by the wet sounds of his experiments, oblivious to the corporate storm gathering outside his walls. The T-Virus was a victory of science over nature, but it was a hollow one. It traded the dream of human evolution for the reality of reanimation. It was not the God-making agent that Spencer wanted, but it was something far more profitable. It was a weapon that could be manufactured and deployed on a global scale. Marcus knew he had changed the world, but he did not realize he had also signed his own death warrant. The success of the T-Virus made him too valuable to control and too dangerous to keep alive. The stability provided by the leeches allowed for the first consistent testing on human subjects. So Marcus no longer had to worry about his volunteers liquefying in minutes. He could watch the infection take hold over hours and days, recording the slow decay of the higher brain. This data was the foundation for the entire bioorganic weapon industry. Without the humble leech, the T-Virus would have remained a lethal curiosity in an African cave. Marcus had bridged the gap, and in doing so, he had opened the door to the apocalypse. Part 24. Progenitor Humans. The confirmed cases of full adaptation and what it produced in each host. In the long history of the research, there are only a handful of confirmed cases of full adaptation to the pure progenitor virus. These individuals are the progenitor humans, the rare few who won the genetic lottery and became the gods that Spencer had envisioned. The gold standard for this adaptation is W and Wesker. After being impaled by the tyrant in '98, the variant of the virus in his blood rebooted his heart and began a total physical overhaul. He gained superhuman speed, strength, and a regenerative ability that made him almost immortal. The adaptation in Wesker produced a host that was physically superior in every way, but maintained their human intelligence. This was the perfect symbiosis that Birkin had chased his entire life. Wesker's speed was so extreme that he could dodge bullets, and his strength allowed him to overpower high-level BOW assets with his bare hands. For Wesker, the virus was not a burden. It was a realization of his own potential. He became a living proof that the eugenics vision of Spencer was not a fantasy, but a terrifying reality. She Alexia Ashford is another confirmed case. Though her adaptation was achieved through the T-Veronica derivative, because Veronica was built on a progenitor base and integrated over 15 years, Alexia achieved a state of full adaptation. She became a being of high intelligence and extreme biological power, capable of controlling the environment around her. She was a queen in every sense of the word, a host who had successfully tamed the prehistoric fire and turned it into a crown. Her transformation was the only one that ever showed a path to stability for the rest of humanity. Oswell Spencer himself briefly achieved a state of adaptation through the various treatments he underwent in his final years. While he remained a frail old man, the progenitor strain kept him alive long after his body should have failed. He used the virus as a fountain of youth, desperately trying to find the Wesker secret that would allow him to shed his human skin. He was a host who was being sustained by the very thing he had stolen, a man who was only still breathing because the virus found him too interesting to let go. The production of a progenitor human was always a matter of extreme intelligence and longevity. The virus seems to favor hosts who are already operating at the peak of human capability. It does not just grant power, it amplifies what is already there. For the Weskers and the Ashfords, the virus was the final step in a process that had started with their education and their genetics. They were the apex predators of a new world, a world where the old rules of biology no longer applied to the people at the top. The existence of these humans is the most dangerous legacy of the African garden. It proved that the virus could be used to create an elite class of biological gods who are separate from the rest of the species. This is the horror of the progenitor story. It is a story of exclusion. It is a virus that rewards the few and destroys the many, creating a hierarchy that is based on blood rather than merit. The progenitor humans are the masters of the apocalypse, the ones who were built to rule the ruins of the world they helped create. Part 25. Spencer's final experiment. What he was still trying to achieve. With Progenitor at the end of his life. At 80 years old, Oswell Spencer was a man trapped in a dying body. He had spent his entire life building an empire based on the Progenitor Virus, but he was still a human subject to the laws of aging. His final experiment was a desperate attempt to use the virus as a fountain of youth. He was no longer interested in building a master race or selling bioweapons. He wanted to find the exact genetic key that had allowed Albert Wesker to adapt so perfectly. He wanted to shed his frail human skin and finally rule the world as its immortal architect. Spencer's lab in his European estate was a monument to this final obsession. He had the most advanced medical equipment and the most potent strains of the raw virus, all dedicated to his own survival. He was using the blood of the Wesker survivors and the data from the Ark facility to find the missing link in his own DNA. He believed that he was the only one worthy of the gift of immortality, a man who had earned his place at the top of the evolutionary ladder through decades of cruelty and ambition. The tragedy of Spencer's final days was that he was still a prisoner of the cultivation wall. No matter how many injections he took or how many serums Birkin had sent him, he could not achieve the full adaptation he craved. His body was too old and too weak to handle the fire of the pure strain. He was a host who was being kept alive by a machine, a man who was more of a parasite than a king. He was the architect of the future, but he was being left behind by the very biology he had discovered. When Albert Wesker finally arrived at the estate in 2006, Spencer realized that his experiment had failed. He saw in Wesker the god he could never be, a host who was young, strong, and perfectly compatible. Spencer tried to claim credit for Wesker's existence, telling him that he was the father of the new world. But Wesker was a predator who had no use for a father. He murdered Spencer in his wheelchair, ending the life of the man who had started it all. The architect died as a frail human, killed by his own creation. Spencer's death marked the end of the original Umbrella vision. He had spent 40 years trying to reach the stairway to the sun, but he never made it past the first step. His final experiment was a reminder that you cannot cheat nature forever. The Progenitor Virus is an engine of evolution, and evolution does not care about the vanity of an old man. Spencer wanted to be the immortal ruler of a new world, but he ended up as just another body in the long history of the virus's victims. The legacy of Spencer's final experiment is a warning about the danger of corporate ego. He believed that because he owned the company, he owned the virus. He thought he could order nature to make him a god. His failure was the final validation of the Ndipaya wisdom. The virus is the judge, and it does not listen to the demands of the wealthy. Spencer died in a room full of expensive machines, a man who had traded the world for a chance to live forever and ended up with nothing but a cold grave. Section 7, The Long Legacy, Part 26. Every major incident that traces back to one flower: Raccoon City, Rockfort, Kijuju, and everything between. The history of the Resident Evil series is a map of disasters that all lead back to a single flower in an African cave. Without the Sonnentreppe, there is no mansion incident. The T-Virus that created the first zombies was a direct derivative of the progenitor strain Marcus had stolen. Every lab beneath the Arklay mountains and every researcher who died there was a result of that one 1966 expedition. The horror of the mansion was just the first wave of a prehistoric infection that was finally reclaiming the surface. Raccoon City was the ultimate proof of the progenitor's destructive legacy. The nuke that erased the city was the only way the world knew how to sanitize a progenitor-based outbreak. Every citizen who was turned into a zombie and every tyrant that walked the streets was a different flavor of the African organism. The G virus that Birkin unleashed was a spontaneous mutation of the original fire, a reminder that the virus was always evolving. Raccoon City was the moment the world realized that Umbrella's secret was too big to be contained by a single company. The incidents at Rockford Island and the Antarctic facility were the results of the Ashford branch of the progenitor tree. Alexia's T-Veronica virus was an elegant, hive-minded version of the original discovery. The horrors encountered by Claire and Chris Redfield were the fruits of a 30-year obsession with the Ashford name. Even in the ice and the isolation, the African flower was still the source of the nightmare. The progenitor legacy was a global network of death that could reach any corner of the planet. The Kijuju outbreak in 2009 was a return to the source. Wesker's Uroboros plan was an attempt to use the pure progenitor strain to finish what Spencer had started. The entire region was turned into a laboratory for the final eugenics filtering of the human race. It was a fitting location for the series to reach its peak, as the story ended in the same subterranean garden where it had begun. The Kijuju incident proved that the world would never be safe as long as the Ndipaya altar remained open. Every major bioterror event in the franchise traces its DNA back to that one West African garden. The C virus, the mold, and the various black market strains are all remixes of the original work. Even when Umbrella was dead, its foundation remained. The Progenitor Virus is the Big Bang of the series, the single ancient organism that provided the material for 30 years of horror. Every monster you have ever fought was a child of the Sonnentreppe, a biological legacy that spans decades and continents. This long legacy is a record of human greed and viral aggression. It shows that the history of the world changed the moment Spencer stepped into that cave. We did not invent the monsters. We just gave them away out of the dark. The Progenitor Virus is the architect of the Resident Evil world, a prehistoric force that has reshaped human history in its own image. Every incident and every death is a petal from the same poisoned flower, a reminder that the past is never truly buried. Part 27. What Progenitor means for the franchise. The single ancient organism behind 30 years of horror. The Progenitor Virus is the narrative anchor for the entire Resident Evil franchise. It provides the why behind every creature and every conspiracy. It represents the terrifying idea that humanity did not invent bioweapons. We just dug up something ancient that was already there. The virus was a prehistoric predator that had been waiting for millions of years for a species ambitious enough to set it free. It was the catalyst for 30 years of biological horror, a single organism that has defined the stakes of the series from the very beginning. What Progenitor means for the franchise is that the threat is not human, but biological. The villains like Spencer and Wesker are just the hosts for an ambition that is much older than they are. The virus does not care about corporate profits or master races. It only cares about mutation and dominance. By making an ancient organism the source of the horror, the series moves the stakes beyond a simple corporate thriller. It becomes a story about the fragility of human DNA in the face of a prehistoric engine of change. The virus also provides a sense of unity to a series that covers so many different locations and characters. Whether you are in a mansion, a city, or an island, you are fighting the same thing. Every derivative and every new strain is just another mask for the Progenitor base. This continuity is what makes the lore of Resident Evil so deep and so rewarding. It is a story of a single discovery that went wrong in 1,000 different ways. A record of a global failure that started with 3 men and a flower. Progenitor is also a metaphor for the dangers of playing God with things we do not understand. The founders thought they could tame the prehistoric fire, but they ended up just providing the fuel. The virus is a judge that exposes the vanity and the weakness of its hosts. It rewarded the Weskers and destroyed the Ashfords, creating a hierarchy that was based on raw biological compatibility. It is a reminder that in the world of Resident Evil, the most dangerous thing you can do is believe you are in control. As the series moves forward, the Progenitor legacy remains the foundation for everything new. Even as the story explores different types of horror, the Big Bang of 1966 still haunts the timeline. The virus is a permanent part of the world's ecosystem now, a biological legacy that cannot be fully sanitized. It is the single ancient organism that ruined the world, a prehistoric ghost that is still walking the earth in the blood of the infected. The Progenitor Virus is the character that never speaks but always acts. It is the silent architect of the apocalypse, the one who built the world of monsters and then stepped back to watch it burn. It means that the war for the future of humanity is not a war between companies, but a war for the survival of the species. The Progenitor Virus is the single most important thing in the Resident Evil universe, a prehistoric flower that became the root of all evil.